Hey guys, tonight we begin with a black tent snapping under a sky that has almost disappeared. You are standing on the Tibetan Plateau with snow blowing sideways across your boots. The air is thin, the ground is hard, and the wind has enough open country to build speed before it reaches you. Your shelter can be taken apart, loaded onto animals, and moved. That sounds useful. It does not sound warm. And that is the first surprise. Tibetan pastoralists did not survive high-altitude winter storms because a portable yak-hair tent worked like a modern insulated cabin. In many places, the real protection came from an entire system around the tent. Choosing a winter base, using terrain and windbreaks, keeping fuel ready, wearing heavy skins and wool, managing animals, and preserving the ability to move when forage failed. The tent mattered because it belonged to that system. Tonight we will stay mainly with pastoral communities of the northern and western Tibetan Plateau, especially evidence from 20th century Changthang and Nagchu, while remembering that practices varied by region and household. If you enjoy quiet history built from ordinary problems, you can like, subscribe, and comment with where you're listening from. No heroic frostbite required. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You bend into the wind and walk toward the tent. From a distance it looks almost too low to be a home. Dark woven panels slope toward the ground. Ropes pull outward to poles and anchors. Nothing about it resembles a thick stone wall. That is partly the point. A house built for mobility cannot carry the weight of a fortress. The cloth is made from coarse yak hair, spun and woven into durable panels. Yak hair also becomes rope. When a household moves, the tent can be taken down, packed, and carried with the rest of the camp. Smithsonian documentation describes these tents as portable enough to load on yaks, yet staked with yak hair ropes to endure fierce plateau winds. So the tent solves one problem immediately. You can bring your shelter to the pasture instead of forcing the herd to return to a fixed house. Then the hidden cost appears. A portable shelter is exposed. It has seams, openings, poles, ropes, and a smoke hole. It depends on tension. Loosen an anchor or choose a bad site, and the wind begins doing carpentry on your behalf. That is why the ground underneath the tent can matter almost as much as the fabric above you. Among the Fala pastoralists studied in western Tibet, the main home base was not simply an arbitrary patch of grass. Researchers recorded established tent sites, dug roughly 3 to 4 feet into the ground, with substantial stone or sod windbreaks around them. The same home base could serve as the winter-spring camp, while satellite camps followed particular herds elsewhere. You step down into that protected space. The romantic picture changes. The tent is portable, but winter survival can include semi-permanent knowledge built into the landscape. A pit lowers part of your living space beneath the full force of the wind. A stone or sod barrier takes the first blow. The fabric still moves above you, but it is no longer standing alone on an empty plain. Not every household solves this the same way. Wealth, labour, local terrain, herd size, and changing political conditions affect what is possible. Some better-off households maintain storehouses. In later decades, many pastoralists spent more winter time in constructed houses. Treating the black tent as the only winter shelter would turn a complicated pastoral system into a camping advertisement. You crouch through the entrance. Inside, the problem changes from wind to heat. There is no forest waiting outside with neat stacks of firewood. Across much of the high plateau, woody fuel is scarce. The herd provides a substitute. Dried yak dung can be collected, stored, and burned for cooking and warmth. A material most modern visitors would avoid stepping on becomes an energy reserve. The arrangement is practical and slightly unfair to the yak. The animal helps carry the tent. Its coarse hair helps make tent cloth and ropes. Its dung feeds the fire. Its milk can become butter, yogurt, and cheese. Much of your household technology quietly traces back to an animal standing outside in the weather. But the fire introduces another limit. A tent cannot simply be sealed tight against the cold. Smoke must leave. Heat rises toward an opening that also gives the weather another place to test you. So survival is not a contest to make the interior perfectly warm. It is a contest to make the cold manageable. You keep clothing on. Heavy sheepskin and goatskin robes used in western Tibet create another layer around the body. Blankets and bedding reduce heat loss where you sit and sleep. The stove gives a local pocket of warmth rather than turning the whole structure into a centrally heated room. You are not trying to defeat winter at the wall. You are dividing the problem into smaller pieces. Block the strongest wind. Keep the shelter standing. Protect the body. Keep fuel available, and preserve the animals that make the arrangement possible. Then you hear them outside. The herd is the reason you are here. A blizzard can threaten people directly, but for a pastoral household, the slower danger may be what snow does to grazing. Animals that normally feed themselves from pasture can be cut off from grass. Severe storms on the Tibetan Plateau have caused large livestock losses. Research in Nagchu found that effective coping depended not only on shelters, but on mobility, cooperation, stored resources, and enough labor to move and manage animals. That changes the meaning of the tent again. Its great winter advantage is not that it creates a perfect indoor climate. It allows people to remain flexible in a landscape where food is spread across pasture, and one valley can become dangerous while another remains usable. You can dismantle a roof. You cannot dismantle a stone house and put it on a yak. But mobility works only if you have somewhere to go, enough people to move animals, access to other grazing, and the strength to travel when conditions are already bad. A household short of workers may understand what should be done and still be unable to do it. A pasture beyond the ridge may be functionally unreachable. That is the deeper constraint beneath the snow. The blizzard is weather. Survival is organization. By late evening, the wind is still pressing at the outer cloth. The ropes twitch, smoke curls upward. Someone adds another piece of dried dung to the fire. Outside, animals shift in the dark. Nothing here is luxurious. Nothing needs to be. The tent is doing only its share. It cuts the wind. It travels. It uses material the herd can supply. The winter base improves its position. Clothing keeps heat close to skin. Fuel keeps a small fire alive. Labor keeps the animals moving. Pasture keeps the animals alive. And the animals, in turn, keep the household supplied. Pull one piece away and the shelter becomes less impressive very quickly. That is why the black tent is a poor symbol for solitary toughness. It is a better symbol for dependency. Tomorrow's safety is tied to the rope in your hand, the dung stacked near the stove, the animals beyond the wall, the grass buried under snow, and the people who can still get up before dawn and move when the weather forces another decision. The wind has not stopped. You have simply learned what must move before it does. You wake before the light reaches the ridge. The fire has dropped to a red glow, and the inside of the tent is colder than it was when he fell asleep. Cloth moves overhead. Something outside gives a short, irritated bleat. When you push through the entrance, the snow has stopped for the moment, but the ground is no longer the ground you remember. Wind has combed it into hard white ridges. This is where the portable tent reveals its second function. It is not only a roof that can move. It belongs to a way of using pasture that assumes the useful grass will not always be beside you. In Pala, a pastoral community in western Tibet studied over decades, households did not simply keep every animal around one permanent camp. They moved to seasonal grazing areas, and they could send subsets of livestock farther away to satellite camps. Even in the early 21st century, when houses, roads, motorcycles and trucks had become more common, families still spent months living in tents at full pasture and established temporary camps for more distant herds. That pattern matters on a morning like this. Snow does not fall evenly across an entire pastoral landscape. One valley can be badly covered, while another receives much less. Historical records from the Pala area show just how local the damage could be. In the summer of 1986, a district west of Pala reportedly lost about 30% of its sheep and goats in a snowstorm, while Pala itself escaped the same loss.
The storm is regional.
The disaster can be local, so you step away from the tent and study the slope. You are not looking for a picturesque route, you are looking for grass. On the Tibetan Plateau, winter forage may already be dry and nutritionally poor before snow covers it. Livestock can lose substantial body weight through the cold season even without a major storm. Once snow or ice seals the plants beneath a crust, the problem becomes brutally simple. The animal may be standing on food it cannot reach. A yak can push and scrape at snow. Sheep and goats have different grazing habits and different vulnerabilities. None of that makes buried pasture unlimited. The household therefore has to solve a moving equation. Which animals need to stay near the main camp? Which can be taken farther? Where has the snow blown thin? Where is there unused forage? How many people can be spared to go with them? The last question is easy to miss from inside a warm study. Animals do not move themselves according to a clever pastoral strategy. People move them. That means mobility is limited by legs, time, household size, health, age, and the number of capable workers available on the day the weather turns bad. Studies of snowstorm coping in Nagchu found that labour could matter even more than livestock shelters. Families with enough workers could send animals farther, divide herds, watch different groups, fetch supplies, or respond to changing conditions. A household with fewer available workers might possess the same knowledge and still have fewer useful choices. You can know where the better pasture lies and still be unable to reach it. The mountain is not impressed by correct information. By mid-morning, the camp has become a workplace. Someone checks ropes and anchors, someone tends the stove, someone handles animals nearest the tent. Others may prepare to take part of the herd toward a grazing area where the wind has stripped snow from the surface. This is why the household and the herd should not be pictured as one tidy unit moving together every time. Pastoral work can split them. Research from the Aru Basin shows that Tibetan herding groups could include animals and people from more than one household. Cooperation helped create workable herd sizes and freed household members for other tasks. It also made it possible to divide animals according to species or age, rather than force every animal into one grazing routine. That sounds administrative until the weather becomes ugly. Then it becomes physical. One person cannot be in 3 valleys. One teenager cannot watch scattered sheep, help a yak through deep snow, collect fuel, repair a rope, and bring food to another camp at the same time. The tent is portable. Human attention is not infinitely portable. So cooperation becomes another form of shelter. Not shelter from wind directly, but shelter from the failure of a single household to meet every demand at once. You walk with a group of animals toward a rise where dark patches of vegetation show through the snow. The wind has done something useful here. It has removed snow from part of the slope and piled it somewhere less convenient. The same force that punished the tent has opened a feeding place. Pastoral survival is full of these awkward reversals. Wind can chill an animal and expose grass. Snow can threaten a herd and later provide moisture. A sheltered hollow can protect a camp, but hold deeper drifting snow nearby. There is no single landscape feature called safe. There are only changing advantages. By afternoon, the weak sunlight gives almost no warmth, but it helps you see the pasture more clearly. Animals spread across the exposed patches. Their work is eating. Yours is making sure the opportunity lasts. If too many animals remain too long on one patch, today's solution becomes tomorrow's shortage. This is where older systems of pasture access become important. In the traditional Phaler system described by Goldstein, pasture rights were not simply a matter of every family taking whatever it could reach. Grazing areas were allocated and periodically adjusted, with livestock numbers and pasture productivity taken into account. That system changed dramatically under later political regimes, But the underlying problem did not disappear. Pasture is not useful merely because it exists. Someone must have legitimate access to it. A family can own a tent, animals, ropes, warm clothing, and plenty of determination. Then discover that the most valuable winter resource is a patch of grass it cannot simply claim. Now the blizzard has turned into a social question. Mobility only protects you when movement remains possible. Cooperation only protects you when other people can help. Stored fodder only protects you while it lasts. A shelter only protects animals placed inside it. And the portable tent only gives you an advantage if the world beyond its ropes still contains somewhere worth moving toward. Near dusk, you bring the animals back from the exposed slope. The tent appears again as a low black shape against the snow. It looks small after a day spent thinking about valleys, grazing rights, labour, and distant camps. That is appropriate. The tent was never the whole technology. The real technology is the pattern connecting camp to pasture, pasture to herd, herd to workers, workers to neighbours, and all of them to decisions made before hunger becomes visible. Inside, someone feeds the fire. Outside, the wind begins filling the hoofprints you made that morning. By tomorrow, the route may look untouched, but you will remember where the grass was. The hoofprints are gone by morning. Wind has brushed the slope clean, leaving only a faint hollow where the animals passed. Inside the tent, the first task is not to admire the weather. It is to make yesterday's resources last through another cold day. You reach for food that began as grass. That connection sounds simple until you follow it all the way through the household. A yak grazing on a thin alpine pasture turns plants that humans cannot eat directly into milk, meat, hair, hide, transport, and dung. Sheep and goats add their own products. In a place where cultivated crops are limited by altitude and climate, the herd does more than provide income. It converts the plateau into things a family can actually use. The conversion is never free. Every cup of milk depends on an animal that has eaten enough. Every load carried by a yak costs energy. Every skin, rope, blanket, or piece of meat begins with an animal that must first survive the season itself. And winter is when that account becomes uncomfortable. You pour hot tea and add butter. The fat matters. Cold weather raises the value of concentrated food because staying warm requires energy, and high-altitude work does not reduce that demand. Tibetan pastoral diets varied across regions and periods, but dairy foods, meat, and barley products formed an important combination in many communities. Butter could be kept and used long after the richest milking period had passed. Dried cheese or curd could also carry part of summer's milk into a colder season. That is the quiet trick. The household does not wait for a blizzard and then ask the herd to produce everything immediately. Some of summer has already been moved forward in time. Milk becomes butter. Curd becomes a dry food. Grass becomes animal tissue. Dung dries into fuel. Hair becomes cloth and rope. The pasture is being stored in different forms all around you. Now the tent looks different again. A coil of rope is stored pasture. A bag of dried dung is stored pasture. Butter in a container is stored pasture. The wool or hair keeping cold air away from your body is stored pasture too, in a less edible form. You are living inside a chain of transformations. This is why losing livestock in a severe snow disaster damages much more than the meat supply. An animal that dies is also future milk that will never be collected, transport that cannot be used, fibre that will not be cut or combed, manure that will not become fuel, and reproductive capacity removed from the herd. One death can echo into several seasons. The animal outside the tent therefore has two lives in the household economy. There is what it gives today, and there is what it may give later. That difference shapes decisions during a storm. If forage is limited, you cannot treat every animal as equally expendable. Age, sex, breeding value, condition, species, and household need all matter. Some animals represent milk production. Some represent transport. Some are future breeding stock. Others may be candidates for slaughter before winter grows worse. The exact choices vary, but the principle is stubborn. Keeping an animal alive can be more valuable than consuming it now. You step outside with a wooden container and the cold hits the skin around your eyes. Nearby, the animals look better equipped for this than you do. Domestic yaks carry dense, long hair and a woolly undercoat that thickens for winter. Their bodies are adapted to cold, high-altitude environments where ordinary cattle perform poorly. They can continue feeding in temperatures far below freezing. That still does not make them storm-proof. Cold tolerance solves only one part of the winter problem. A yak can wear an excellent coat and still starve. Once deep or crusted snow blocks access to forage, insulation cannot manufacture calories. Studies of yaks through the cold season describe nutritional stress and weight loss when forage quality and availability decline. The animal can conserve heat impressively while its energy account is moving in the wrong direction. You see the contradiction standing in front of you. The creature that helps make the household resilient is itself vulnerable to the same pasture failure threatening the household. So the work begins again. Animals are pushed toward accessible grass. Weak individuals need attention. Snow conditions have to be read. Routes must be checked. If fodder has been stored or purchased, someone decides when the emergency is serious enough to use it. Using reserves too early may leave too little later. Using them too late may save nothing. This is not the satisfying kind of problem where tradition supplies one perfect answer. It is rationing under uncertainty. The sky gives no receipt showing how many storm days remain. Back at the tent, another small reserve is waiting by the stove. Dried dung does not look like wealth, but fuel scarcity makes appearances irrelevant. Across treeless or sparsely wooded parts of the plateau, yak dung has long been an important fuel. The herd gathers vegetation over a wide area. Digestion concentrates the remains into something people can collect near grazing and camping places. Once dried, it can be burned for cooking and heat. There is a modest, circular elegance to this. The yak eats the landscape. The household burns part of what comes back out. Nobody planned the yak as a renewable heating appliance, but winter encourages practical interpretations. Yet this reserve also depends on work. Dung has to be collected, it has to dry, it has to be handled and stored before snow makes the ground difficult. Fuel sitting wet under a drift is less helpful than fuel stacked where a person can reach it. So another invisible layer of blizzard survival appears months before the storm. Repetitive preparation. Someone milked. Someone churned. Someone dried curd. Someone gathered dung. Someone twisted fibre. Someone repaired bags. Someone moved the animals often enough for them to keep feeding. A dramatic storm may last days. The preparation behind surviving it can occupy an entire pastoral year. And much of that labour is easy to erase when the story is reduced to a black tent against white snow. By evening, you understand why. The tent is visually memorable. A person collecting dung in dry weather is not. A woman processing milk for later use does not look like a blizzard scene. A herder checking the condition of animals before winter does not look like emergency survival. But those ordinary actions decide how many options remain when the sky finally closes. The storm strips away the illusion that survival starts when danger becomes visible. By then, the important inventory already exists. Animals, food, fuel, fibre, labour, access to pasture, people willing and able to cooperate. The tent gathers those things into one small space, but it did not create them. Outside, a yak lowers its head and pulls at a patch of grass showing through the snow. For the moment, it can still reach dinner. That small fact is carrying almost everything else. The wind has found the loose edge of your robe before breakfast. It slips through the opening near your neck, runs down your back, and reminds you that the tent was never supposed to warm every cubic foot of air around you. That would be an expensive argument with the plateau. Instead, you warm a much smaller space. Your body. A thick sheepskin robe does something the tent cannot do efficiently. It traps a layer of air close to skin and moves with you when you leave the stove. Smithsonian documentation of Tibetan pastoral material culture records sheepskin robes as ordinary nomadic clothing, made from a material that is warm, thick, and still practical enough for daily work. The insulation travels wherever the worker goes. That changes the scale of the problem. The fire does not need to make the whole tent comfortable in the modern sense. The tent cuts wind. The robe slows heat loss. Bedding protects the body when work stops. Hot food and drink add warmth from inside. Each layer handles one part of the cold. You pull the robe tighter and squat beside the stove. Its heat reaches your hands first. Your back is still cold. Move a little farther away, and even your hands lose the argument. That unevenness is useful to understand. Heat inside a large fabric shelter is local. A stove or hearth creates a warmer center. But the roof still has openings, and the walls still breathe. Smoke has to escape. People come and go. Wind presses at seams. The goal is not to create the sealed, evenly heated room that a modern thermostat trains you to expect. The useful question is simpler. Can you keep the people warm enough to work, eat, sleep, and wake up capable of doing it again? Inside traditional yak-hair tents, the stove helps organize the room as well as heat it. Smithsonian field documentation describes sleeping positions around it. In one documented arrangement, guests, elders, and parents slept on the right side, while younger people slept on the left. Other communities and households varied, but the important point is physical. Sleeping space is arranged around the working center of the tent, not separated from it by hallways and bedrooms. At night, the household contracts. During daylight, one person may be outside with sheep, another handling yaks, another processing food, another repairing gear. After dark, bodies, blankets, containers, saddles, tools, and stored supplies all occupy a surprisingly compact world. Compactness has advantages. Every trip outside costs warmth. Boots must be found. A robe must be pulled closed. The entrance has to open. Wind enters with you. Snow sticks to clothing and melts where heat reaches it. So small routines matter. Fuel is kept where it can be reached. Water and food are managed before people settle. Bedding is laid where the household expects to sleep. Items needed in darkness have habitual places because searching for a missing object with cold hands is a poor evening hobby. Nothing here needs to be romantic. Convenience is a survival technology when every unnecessary movement has a cost. You sit down on a skin or mat near the ground. This creates another problem. Cold is not arriving only through the walls. It is beneath you. A body pressed directly against frozen or chilled ground can lose heat by conduction. Pastoral households therefore used skins, mats, blankets, and other bedding that placed insulating material between the sleeper and the surface below. The objects are ordinary enough to disappear from heroic accounts, yet they protect the largest areas of the body during the hours when a person is least active. That matters because activity has been helping you all day. Walking behind animals produces heat. Lifting fuel produces heat. Repairing a rope produces heat. Standing still does not. Sleeping certainly does not. The moment work ends, the body becomes more dependent on insulation already prepared around it. You remove as little warmth as possible from the system. Clothing does not automatically vanish simply because it is bedtime. Bedding adds another barrier. People sleep within the shared interior rather than retreating into isolated rooms. The stove may be tended while people are awake, but fuel remains limited, and no household benefits from burning tomorrow's supply merely to imitate summer until dawn. Warm enough is the standard. Not warm everywhere. Not warm all night without effort. Warm enough? The difference sounds modest, but it exposes a larger feature of winter life on the plateau. Comfort is often attached to the body rather than the building. Your robe moves with you. Your boots move with you. A blanket can be rolled. A skin can be packed. A tent can be dismantled. Even warmth has been made portable. This does not mean people were indifferent to cold, quite the opposite. The system makes sense because cold is taken seriously enough to be managed at several scales at once. First the landscape, then the windbreak, then the tent, then the stove, then the robe, then the bedding. Finally, the small pocket of air beside your skin. No single layer has to perform a miracle. Together they reduce the number of ways the weather can reach you at once. A hard gust strikes the tent and the roof answers with a long flutter. Nobody looks surprised. That sound is part of the night. The more urgent sound would be a rope beginning to fail. You listen again. The anchors hold. This is where sleeping becomes another form of work, although a quiet one. People do not simply disappear into unconsciousness while the storm handles itself. Severe weather can require checking animals, adding fuel, watching the shelter, or responding when something outside changes. Rest exists inside responsibility. A missing yak does not become less missing because it is midnight. A drifting entrance does not clear itself. A loosened line will not politely wait for breakfast. So the household sleeps beside the tools of tomorrow. By late night the stove has weakened again. The brightest glow sits low in the firebox. Conversation thins. Someone shifts beneath bedding. Outside, the temperature keeps dropping, but inside, there is no dramatic moment when the tent suddenly becomes warm. Instead, the body notices smaller victories. Your feet are no longer exposed. Your back is off the cold ground. The wind is mostly outside. Your robe still holds the heat you carried into bed. The person beside you is breathing steadily. That is enough to change what survival looks like. It is not a blazing fire defeating a blizzard. It is a series of barriers, each one modest, each one buying a little more time before heat escapes. The portable tent succeeds because it does not work alone, and neither does the sleeping body inside it. Before dawn, the fire will need attention again. So will the animals? For a few hours, though, the household has reduced the plateau to one manageable task. Keep the warmth you already have. By afternoon, the wind has changed its mind. It had been driving snow from the west. Now it cuts across the camp from another angle, catching a different wall of the tent and pressing the cloth inward. The ropes that felt quiet an hour ago begin to hum. You go outside. This is not a repair made after something breaks. It is maintenance while the shelter is still working. A yak-hair tent survives wind through tension. The woven panels pull against ropes, poles, and anchors. Smithsonian descriptions of Tibetan black tents emphasize that the same yak-hair used for the cloth also becomes strong rope, and that the tents are staked to withstand fierce plateau winds. But withstand is not the same as ignore. A rope can loosen. An anchor can shift. Snow can accumulate where the wind drops it. A flap can begin beating harder than it should. So you walk the perimeter with your hands exposed just long enough to check what the storm is changing. The first thing you notice is that snowfall and snow depth are not the same thing. Wind rearranges almost everything. One side of the tent may be scoured nearly bare, or the other collects a growing drift. A hollow that looks sheltered in calm weather can become a trap for blowing snow. A ridge can be miserable for a person, yet leave patches of forage exposed for animals. The storm is not laying down a neat white blanket. It is building terrain. That makes site choice a continuing decision rather than a one-time act. Research from Fowler shows how uneven the consequences of winter weather could be. Pasture and livestock losses varied sharply between neighbouring places and even between households. One severe snow event could damage herds in one locality while another nearby escaped much of the loss. The tent moves. Knowledge stays attached to the landscape. You know which side takes the hardest wind. You know where snow tends to pile. You know where animals can be brought close without turning the entrance into a churned mess of hooves. You know which low place protects the shelter and which low place simply collects weather. None of that appears in the tent itself. A stranger could own the same cloth and still choose a worse place to put it. Now the snow begins to thicken near the entrance. You clear it before it becomes a wall. This is a small action, but the logic is the same as everything else in the camp. Do not wait for a manageable problem to become a heavy one. A blocked entrance is inconvenient. A blocked entrance in darkness, with animals needing attention outside, is a different kind of problem. The same applies to ropes. A slightly loose line is easy to tighten. A collapsed section of roof in a blizzard requires more hands, more time, and much colder fingers. So the storm creates a rhythm. Inside, outside, check, adjust, return, warm your hands, go again. There is no single dramatic moment when the household defeats the weather. There is only a long sequence of corrections made before failure becomes expensive. That pattern extends beyond the human shelter. Livestock can also be protected by walls, enclosures, or built shelters, especially in more recent periods. Research from Nagchu examined covering and sheltering animals during severe snowstorms. Shelters could help, but researchers found something less intuitive. Shelter provision by itself was less effective than mobility, while the availability of labor could be still more important to a household's ability to protect livestock. A roof over an animal solves exposure. It does not solve an empty stomach. During harsh winters, livestock rely heavily on standing, senesced vegetation. When snow prevents them from reaching it, starvation joins cold as a major danger. The Nagchu research notes that animals may already lose substantial body weight through an ordinary winter before a severe snowstorm makes forage inaccessible. You look toward the herd. Their backs are dusted white. Some stand with their bodies angled away from the wind. Others keep searching at the edge of a scoured patch. The question is no longer simply where to put them tonight. It is whether this place can still feed them tomorrow. That is why a portable human shelter and a fixed livestock shelter can pull a household in opposite directions. The tent makes movement possible. A substantial animal shelter makes staying attractive. Neither is automatically wrong. The value changes with snow depth, forage, labor, distance, herd condition, and the length of the storm. A household has to decide with incomplete information. Move too early, and you may spend precious animal energy traveling into conditions that are no better. Wait too long, and weaker animals may no longer be capable of making the trip. The storm does not announce which mistake you are about to make. It simply keeps snowing. Near the tent, another gust lifts loose powder over the camp. For a few seconds, the whole place disappears behind moving white. Then the view returns. You tighten one more line. The rope is rough against your palm. This simple object carries more responsibility than its size suggests. It connects fabric to ground. It transfers the pull of the wind away from one moving panel and into the larger structure. It can be retied, replaced, packed, and carried when the camp moves. That repairability matters. Portable equipment earns its place partly because people can maintain it with materials and skills already inside the pastoral system. Yak-hair supplies both woven tent material and the ropes used to secure it. You do not need the tent to be indestructible. You need damage to remain understandable. A broken component that can be recognized and repaired is less frightening than a sealed technology nobody in camp can fix. That is another reason the image of a fragile tent can be misleading. Fragile and repairable are not opposites. A fabric shelter gives and moves, parts wear, people intervene. Its strength includes the fact that intervention is expected. By evening, the wind eases for 20 minutes. nobody assumes the storm is finished. That short quiet is used. Snow is knocked away from important edges, fuel is checked, animals are counted. The path toward the nearest workable grazing is discussed. Anything loose outside is made less loose. The camp is preparing for the next gust, while the air is briefly still. By now, the storm has shown you another part of the system. The shelter is not a passive object. It is a relationship between material, ground, weather, and people paying attention. The tent survives because hands keep noticing what the wind is trying to change. The herd survives because people keep noticing what snow is doing to grass. And the household survives because it keeps correcting small failures before they become large ones. Darkness comes early under the cloud. You duck back through the entrance. Behind you, the ropes tighten as the wind returns. They hold. For now, that is enough. The herd does not leave the tent as one animal. It leaves as several different answers to the same landscape. The yaks move first, heavier and slower. Sheep gather more tightly. Goats pull at the edges and look interested in places the others ignore. By the time the animals spread across the slope, the camp's economy has divided itself into bodies with different appetites, different products, and different tolerances. That variety is not decorative. Across the Tibetan steppe, pastoral households have long kept mixtures of yak, sheep, goats, horses and, in some regions, yak cattle crosses. The proportions change sharply with landscape. FAO surveys found yak much more important in wetter eastern areas, while sheep and goats dominate many drier western districts, where the vegetation suits them better. So a mixed herd is partly a map. Look at the animals and you can begin to see what kind of pasture surrounds them. In one western Tibetan case, fallow sheep and goats made up most of the herd, while yaks formed a much smaller share. Farther east, in wetter alpine meadow country, households could be overwhelmingly yak-based. There was no universal Tibetan herd hiding behind the word nomad. People adjusted animals to land. That becomes useful when weather starts removing options. You follow the sheep onto a patch where the snow is thinned. They lower their heads quickly and begin cropping what they can reach. The yaks work another section. Goats range through the same broad landscape but may use the available vegetation differently. Field research in Fala found that sheep, goats and yaks did not always select exactly the same vegetation types. Their diets could overlap strongly, but the amount of overlap changed from grazing area to grazing area because the plants available also changed. Small ruminants in one wetter area made greater use of browse, while livestock elsewhere relied more heavily on grasses and sedges. The lesson is not that every species politely eats a separate menu. They do not. The useful difference is smaller. Several kinds of livestock give a household more ways to turn an uneven pasture into food and products. That matters because the plateau itself is uneven. A wet meadow is not a dry steppe. A windswept slope is not a sheltered valley floor. A grazing patch in summer is not the same patch under February snow. A herd built around only one type of animal would tie more of the household's fortune to the conditions that suit that animal. Keeping several species spreads some of that dependence. Not all of it. A major snow disaster can still hurt everything at once. That distinction matters. Diversification does not make a blizzard harmless. It makes the household less simple. And less simple can be useful. The yak carries loads, provides milk in many regions, supplies dung for fuel, and handles rough high country extremely well. FAO descriptions note that yak are especially valued for riding in rough terrain, extreme altitude, and snow. Sheep contribute meat, milk in some western regions, wool, skins, and animals that can be traded or consumed. Goats add milk, meat, skins, and valuable fine fibre. A horse gives speed and riding capacity, but consumes resources while producing a different set of benefits. Now imagine the household's winter resources not as one pile of wealth, but as several columns, assured transport. Milk, meat, fiber, fuel, animals for sale, animals for breeding. Each species fills those columns differently. The result is flexibility, but it also creates work. You cannot manage every herd in exactly the same way. Milking animals need one routine. Dry animals may be sent elsewhere. Young or weak stock need closer attention. Sheep and goats may be kept together while yaks graze separately. Researchers on the plateau documented milking and non-milking herds and different groups being managed according to production needs and pasture. That means the mixed herd that protects against one kind of risk can increase another. Labour. Every separate group needs eyes. Every distant grazing patch takes time. Every species adds knowledge that somebody has to carry in memory. Which animals are falling behind? Which females are producing milk? Which pasture can support which group? Which animals can be spared for a longer move? You count bodies, but what you are really counting is obligations. The portable tent makes it possible to follow those obligations across space. It does not make them disappear. By midday, clouds return from the west. You watch the animals more carefully. A household facing a storm does not only ask how many animals it owns, it has to ask what kind of animals they are, and what losing each group would remove from the household. Lose pack yaks and the next move becomes harder. Lose milking females and food production changes. Lose breeding females and the damage stretches forward into future herd growth. Lose too many sheep or goats and meat, fiber, trade, and household reserves shrink together. This is why livestock wealth cannot be read simply as head count. Two herds of the same size can perform very different jobs. FAO surveys across the Tibetan steppe show striking differences in herd composition from county to county, shaped by vegetation, climate, labour, local preferences, and management history. The variation itself is evidence that pastoralism was not one frozen tradition repeated across the plateau. It was adjustment. Sometimes deliberate, sometimes inherited, sometimes forced by conditions. The storm forces another adjustment now. A section of grazing that worked yesterday has collected more snow. The yaks can still reach some forage, but the smaller animals are moved toward another exposed strip. One group turns left, another remains closer to camp. The herd separates. So does the labour. You go with one group while someone else watches another. For a few hours the tent disappears behind the rise, and that is an important reminder. Portable shelter does not mean everybody spends winter huddled inside it. The system survives because people repeatedly leave shelter. They expose themselves to cold so animals can feed. They separate from one another so livestock can exploit different ground. They accept a smaller, harder domestic space because the household's real energy supply is walking outside on four legs. Late in the afternoon, the animals begin coming back. Not all at once. First one group appears against the snow, then another. The counts begin almost automatically. A missing animal is not merely lost property. It may be next month's milk, next move's transport, next year's offspring, or part of the fuel supply once its dung is dried. That is why the herd is both protection and vulnerability. The more functions animals perform, the more painful their loss becomes. Inside the tent, the stove catches again. A yak-hair rope hangs nearby. A skin lies under someone's knees. Butter goes into tea. Outside, sheep crowd together in the fading light. Four separate objects seem unrelated until you follow them backward. They all begin with grass. The household has not defeated the plateau by escaping dependence on it. It has done almost the opposite. It has learned to divide that dependence among different animals, different pastures, different products, and different seasons. That division creates options. And in a blizzard, options are a form of warmth. The snow begins again before dark. This time, you do not look first at the tent. You look at which animals are still eating. The storm becomes expensive on the third day. Not because the tent has suddenly failed. The ropes still hold. The stove still burns. The animals are still alive. The problem is that every useful action now consumes something you cannot replace quickly. Fuel, food, animal strength, human strength, daylight, and labor. That last resource is easy to underestimate because it does not sit in a sack beside the stove. You notice it when somebody is missing. One person has gone with a group of sheep, another is checking yaks beyond the ridge. Someone must remain near the main camp. Someone must feed the fire, handle food, watch children, help weaker animals, and respond if a rope or wall gives trouble. The household suddenly feels small. Fieldwork in Pala makes that constraint unusually visible. The pastoral unit was organized around households, but households were also grouped into small local units called zug. Researchers recorded 2 to 9 households within each zug, sharing exclusive use rights over assigned pasture. They also found that satellite camps could only be established when enough labor was available. That is not an abstract detail. It tells you why a blizzard can expose social structure. A family with many animals but too few capable workers may possess wealth it cannot fully protect. A family with fewer animals but reliable help may have more ways to respond. You can own 50 ropes. You still need hands to pull them. By late morning, another worker reaches the camp through the blowing snow. There is no dramatic rescue. He is simply another adult body arriving where work has multiplied. Now 2 people can deal with the animals while one returns to the tent. A separated group can be checked without abandoning the main herd. A weak animal can be pushed or led while the others keep moving. This is the kind of help that rarely survives in a photograph. The photograph shows the tent. It does not show the person who watched your sheep yesterday so you could repair equipment. It does not show the relative who joined a satellite camp because your own household was short of workers. It does not show the neighboring household whose animals share the same grazing unit and whose decisions can affect how quickly a pasture is used. Yet those relationships can change the outcome of a storm. Snow disasters create labor at several scales. Pastoral risk management guidance from the FAO notes that heavy snow can require extra work not only within households but at communal level. Clearing snow, rescuing isolated animals, and moving livestock all demand people at the same time. The storm increases work precisely when movement becomes harder. That is a nasty little equation. The deeper the snow, the more labor you may need. The deeper the snow, the more exhausting that labor becomes. You walk toward a drift where 2 sheep have pushed themselves into a bad position. One person could probably pull the first free. 2 make the job faster. 3 can keep the rest of the animals from scattering while it happens. Nothing here is mysterious. That is exactly why it matters. Cooperation converts people into options. But cooperation has boundaries. Pasture itself is not automatically communal in the sense of being open to anyone. In the post-commune Fala system documented by Goldstein and Beale, small household groups held exclusive usufruct rights over particular pasture allocations. A neighbouring group might have grass you need, but access could require permission or a local decision. Researchers even recorded disputes and ad hoc arrangements when some groups faced shortages while others had unused pasture. So the social network does not erase scarcity. It governs who may respond to it. You can help your neighbour pull a sheep from snow without giving that neighbour permanent grazing rights. You can share work without sharing every resource. You can cooperate today and still argue about pasture tomorrow. That is ordinary human life, even at 16,000 feet. The old fantasy of the nomad as a completely independent household begins to break apart. Mobility sounds individual. In practice, moving a pastoral economy involves other people. Someone has to remain behind. Someone has to go ahead. Someone must know whether the destination can be used. Someone must handle the animals that cannot travel at the same pace. If one part of the herd is sent to a satellite camp, that camp needs a tent, workers, food, and equipment of citations. Parlour researchers recorded households operating more than one camp at once, sometimes a home base, a yak camp, and a separate sheep-goat camp. They also noted that the ideal arrangement was often impossible when labour was insufficient. The portable tent has now multiplied the household. That is the hidden cost of mobility. You can spread risk across space only by spreading people across space. And people divided across several camps cannot all help one another instantly when the weather turns. The advantage creates its own vulnerability. By afternoon, the snow eases enough to see another tent in the distance. It belongs to people whose winter is connected to yours without being identical to it. Their herd may be larger. The labour supply may be better. Their pasture may have drifted differently. One household can be struggling while another nearby is still coping. That local variation helps explain why storm losses can be so uneven. Weather differs over surprisingly short distances, and so do labour, herd composition, pasture access, stored resources, and household wealth. A blizzard does not strike a blank map of equal families. It strikes a social landscape. That matters when people begin deciding what can be shared. A little labour may be easy to lend. A little fuel may be possible. Pasture is harder. Fodder is finite. Breeding animals are not casual gifts. And when a crisis grows long enough, generosity begins competing with the responsibility to protect your own household. Nobody needs to become selfish for that limit to appear. Two families can both need the same grass. The plateau has no extra pasture hidden behind good intentions. So cooperation works best before every reserve is exhausted. You help when the task is still manageable. You exchange work while both households still have something to exchange. You maintain relationships before the storm arrives. Once again, preparation hides inside ordinary life. By evening, the extra worker leaves. His footprints stretch away from the tent and fade into blown snow. For a few hours, his presence gave your household more reach than it possessed alone. That is what the social system has been doing all along. The yak turns grass into fuel and food. The tent turns fibre into shelter. A group of people turns separate bodies into labour that can be moved where it is needed. None of these conversions is perfect. All of them by options. Inside, someone counts the remaining dung fuel. Outside, someone else counts animals. And somewhere beyond the ridge, another household is making the same calculations. The storm has finally pushed you past the edge of the tent. Survival no longer looks like a family sealed safely inside black cloth. It looks like a web of obligations stretched across snow. Portable shelter lets the household move. Other people make that movement usable. By the fourth morning, the snow has stopped falling. That sounds like good news until you look at the animals. The storm has ended in the sky, but it has not ended on the ground. White still covers most of the pasture. A few dark strips appear where the wind has scraped the slope clean. The strongest animals reach them first. Weaker ones stand longer before moving. This is where a blizzard stops being a weather event and becomes an accounting problem. The household now has reserves, but every reserve has a clock inside it. Dried dung can be burned only once. Stored food can be eaten only once. Fodder, where households have it, disappears one mouthful at a time. An animal's body fat is also a reserve, though nobody stacks it beside the tent. Pastoral research on the Tibetan Plateau repeatedly returns to this point. Winter disaster is shaped not only by how much snow falls, but by livestock condition before the snow arrives, and by whether enough forage remains available afterward. Herders in Nagchu have reported that snowstorms are especially difficult after drought, when animals enter winter already weakened. So you look at the herd differently. Yesterday, a yak was transport. Milk, dung, hair, future calves, and wealth. Today, it is also a body spending stored energy. Every hour it cannot graze, the account moves downward. This is why the timing of bad weather matters so much. A storm early in the cold season may strike animals with more reserves and leave more time for conditions to improve. A storm after months of poor forage meets bodies that have already been paying winter's bill. The same snow can therefore produce different losses. Not because one herd is brave, because one herd has more left to spend. You walk toward a thin sheep near the edge of the group. Its back looks sharper under the wall than it did weeks ago. The animal is still standing. That is not the same as saying it is safe. Less arrives gradually. First, the pasture becomes poorer. Then animals lose weight. Then movement costs more. Then snow hides forage. Then weaker animals fall behind. By the time one finally collapses, the crisis has been underway for a long time. This slow sequence explains why emergency fodder can matter so much. Modern pastoral risk planning in Qinghai has emphasized estimating whether feed and fodder reserves are sufficient to carry livestock through winter and spring and to cover a snow emergency. The principle is straightforward even when exact practices differ across place and period. Forage stored before a crisis can substitute, for a while, for pasture animals can no longer reach. For a household relying heavily on natural grazing, however, the words "for a while" are doing important work. You cannot store an entire plateau. Cut fodder requires labour. It requires land where useful material can be gathered or grown. It requires transport. It requires storage dry enough to prevent waste. And a large herd can consume astonishing quantities once daily grazing stops. A reserve that looks generous beside the tent can become very small when divided by hundreds of animal days. So feeding is not simply a decision to be kind to the herd. It is triage. Which animals receive scarce supplements first? Which animals are most likely to recover? Which breeding females are too valuable to lose? Which pack animals will be needed if the camp has to move? Which weak animals are consuming feed without a good chance of surviving? There is no universal answer, and the historical sources do not give us a neat Tibetan rulebook for every storm. That uncertainty matters. A real household is making decisions with imperfect knowledge, not following an emergency chart written for our convenience. The uncomfortable option is slaughter. Pastoral economies regularly convert animals into meat, and winter can make timing more urgent. If an animal is likely to die, slaughtering it while the carcass still has value may preserve food that would otherwise be lost. But this is not free meat appearing during a crisis. You are consuming capital. A ewe eaten now cannot produce lambs later. A female yak lost from the breeding herd removes future calves and possibly future milk. A pack animal killed for meat will not carry the tent when spring movement begins. The household solves hunger today by shrinking its options tomorrow. That is the hidden cost inside nearly every emergency reserve. Use fuel now, and less remains later. Feed hay now, and less remains later. Slaughter livestock now, and fewer productive animals remain later. Move animals now, and they spend energy travelling. Wait, and they may spend even more energy standing over buried grass. A blizzard creates choices where every answer has a price. By midday, the sun returns sharply. The snow surface begins to glitter. It looks gentler from inside the tent than it did during the storm. This can be deceptive. Wind-packed or crusted snow may still block animals from forage even after visibility improves. The weather that threatened the roof has passed, while the more dangerous feeding problem remains underfoot. That is why severe snow events can continue killing livestock after the dramatic part is over. Research in Western Tibet documented how uneven such losses could be. In 1986, several encampments near Pala reportedly lost about 30% of their animals during an unusual 6-day snowstorm, while neighbouring Pala itself escaped major losses. Within communities, households could also experience very different neonatal mortality. The lesson is not that one village knew the secret. The evidence points toward contingency. Snow depth, wind, pasture exposure, herd condition, labor, local geography, timing. Sometimes a difference of a few kilometers changes the outcome. Sometimes a difference in one household's reserves does. You return to the stove and someone opens a container of food. Human reserves have clocks too. The family must eat while protecting enough supplies for whatever comes next. Fuel must last. People need enough energy to walk with animals, clear snow, haul material, and make decisions in cold air. Saving every animal would be pointless if the workers collapsed trying. The pastoral system therefore has a hard center beneath its appearance of flexibility. It can bend. It cannot spend the same resource twice. That is why the portable tent is again only one piece of the answer. Mobility buys access to another pasture, if another pasture is reachable. Fodder buys time, if fodder exists. Fat on an animal buys time, if the animal entered winter strong. Neighbors buy labor, if they have labor to spare. Slaughter buys food, if you accept the loss of future production. Every solution converts one form of security into another. Late in the day, several animals find a wind-scoured patch. Their heads drop. They begin eating. Nothing dramatic happens. No one cheers. But for the household, this may be better than any heroic rescue. Grass entering an animal means stored fodder does not have to. The animal keeps more of its body reserve. Tomorrow's decision becomes slightly less desperate. And that is how many winter crises are survived. Not by finding one resource large enough to defeat the storm, but by preventing each smaller reserve from reaching zero at the same time. The sky is clear now. The emergency is not, but one strip of exposed grass has bought another day. The clear sky lasts less than a day. By evening, a pale veil has returned over the western horizon. The wind is not yet violent. Snow is not yet falling. Nothing has failed. This is the moment when survival is easiest to misunderstand. You might expect the household to need a precise forecast. It does not have one. What it has is a landscape already divided by memory. Certain winter ranges are better protected. Some slopes lose snow quickly because wind strips them. Some hollows collect it. Some grazing areas hold useful forage later into the cold season. Water, distance, exposure, and the condition of the herd all affect whether a place is worth using. FAO accounts of Tibetan yak pastoralism describe herders using detailed knowledge of local climatic patterns and key grazing areas to select favorable winter ranges that offer both protection from snowstorms and enough forage during periods of stress. That is a different kind of forecasting. You are not predicting the exact hour when snow will begin. You are arranging the household so an imperfect prediction hurts less. Before the first flake falls, the tent may already be standing, in a place chosen partly for winter conditions. Animals may already be using seasonal pasture rather than exhausting the ground needed later. Fuel has been gathered, food has been processed, equipment has been repaired. The strongest workers know which routes connect the camp to other grazing. Preparation is spread across the landscape. The weather only reveals whether it was enough. You walk uphill until the tent becomes a dark patch behind you. From here, the difference between two slopes is obvious. One lies open to the wind. Dry grass still shows through in streaks. The other sits behind a rise. It feels calmer on your face, but old snow has gathered more deeply in the lee. Shelter for a person can become poor grazing for an animal. Exposure can preserve forage by sweeping snow away. Once again, there is no place that is simply good. There are trade-offs. This is why local ecological knowledge matters more than a generic rule such as camp out of the wind. A household has to understand how wind, snow, grass, and animals interact at this particular place. The same decision may change with season. A summer camp selected for access to rich grazing does not automatically make the best winter base Across the Tibetan pastoral zone, movement between seasonal ranges has been one of the ways herders distribute grazing pressure and match livestock needs to changing forage and climate. FAO's review of the Tibetan steppe describes livestock being moved regularly between seasonal pastures, with grass deliberately reserved into autumn and early winter, so animals entered the long cold period in better condition. That movement also protects future options. Grass left unused in one season can become valuable later. A pasture that looks unnecessary while the weather is calm may become emergency space after snow covers another area. This sounds efficient until you remember the boundary. You cannot preserve every patch. Livestock have to eat today, so the household is constantly borrowing from the future without knowing exactly how expensive the future will become. By morning, the western veil has thickened. People begin ordinary work, but the work has changed slightly. A rope receives attention now, rather than after the wind rises. Fuel is placed where it will remain accessible. Animals are watched for condition, not merely counted. A route toward exposed grazing is mentally checked. None of these actions require certainty that a blizzard is coming. That is the point. Good preparation is useful even when the storm never arrives. This is a safer strategy than waiting for dramatic evidence. A broad review of the Tibetan steppe describes seasonal movement as a deliberate grazing system. Herds rotate between pastures so summer forage can be used without consuming everything needed later, while grass is reserved for autumn and early winter as animals prepare for the long cold season. A tent therefore enters a blizzard carrying the history of previous weeks. Was the cloth maintained? Were ropes usable? Did animals reach winter in reasonable condition? Was fuel dry? Had grazing been managed well enough to leave alternatives? When the answer to several of those questions is no, a stronger tent can only compensate so far. The sky darkens. Now the temptation is to turn local knowledge into something mystical. That would miss the harder and more interesting truth. Pastoral knowledge does not remove uncertainty. Herders can know a landscape intimately and still be surprised by exceptional snow. They can understand winter ranges and still lose animals. They can make sensible decisions and encounter a storm that exceeds the reserves available. Research on Nagchu pastoralists found that local responses to snowstorms centered on practical strategies such as mobility, stored feed, and covers or shelters for livestock. These strategies reduced vulnerability, but none guaranteed safety. Knowledge gives choices. It does not command the weather. That limitation matters because stories about traditional survival often become too neat. One generation passes down a secret. The secret defeats nature. Everyone goes home warm. Real systems are less generous. Experience helps you recognize recurring patterns. It cannot promise that this winter will behave like the last one. So the household prepares for ranges of possibility, rather than one perfect prediction. If snow stays light, the animals continue grazing. If one pasture closes, another may remain exposed. If travel becomes difficult, stored resources buy time. If the herd must split, labor is reassigned. If conditions exceed all of those buffers, losses begin anyway. The strength lies in layers. By afternoon, the first flakes arrive. You can still see the ridge. There is time to move animals closer. Check the entrance and bring exposed objects under control. But another decision now appears. How long do you wait? Moving too soon can waste animal energy and abandon usable pasture. Moving too late can leave weak stock trapped behind deeper snow. This is the point where knowledge becomes judgment. No object in the tent can make that judgment for you. The rope does not know when to move. The yak does not know which distant pasture the household has rights to use. Stored fodder does not know whether it should be fed tonight or saved for a worse morning. People have to connect the pieces. They compare what they see now with what they remember. How quickly is the wind building? Where did snow accumulate in similar conditions? Which animals are already thin? How much accessible grass remains? Who can travel? What reserve will be hardest to replace? The answer is not one prediction. It is a decision made before all the evidence is available. That may be the most important skill the tent never shows you. The shelter is visible after the storm begins. Pastoral judgment matters before the shelter is tested. By dusk, snow has covered the first set of tracks near camp. The tent ropes are tight. Fuel is inside. The animals are near enough to manage. Maybe the storm will pass. Maybe it will deepen. You do not know. But survival has never depended on knowing everything. It depends on arranging enough small advantages before uncertainty becomes immobility. The wind rises. This time, the household is already moving before it has to. The next storm does not begin with snow. It begins with a door. A wooden door. After days of watching black cloth flex under the wind, the object feels almost suspiciously solid. Behind it is a small winter house used during the cold season, part of a pattern that became increasingly common across much of the Tibetan steppe in recent decades. FAO descriptions note that many pastoralists built houses and livestock shelters on traditional winter-spring pastures, where households might spend 6 or 7 months of the year. That seems, at first, to contradict everything the tent has taught you. If mobility is so valuable, why build anything you cannot fold? Because mobility has limits, and a good pastoral system does not worship one solution after the conditions that made it useful have changed. You step inside. The walls do not move when the wind pushes them. The roof does not need tensioned ropes. A door can be shut against drifting snow more completely than a fabric flap. Supplies can be stored where they do not have to travel every time part of the herd moves. None of this makes the tent obsolete. It changes its job. A household can use a more permanent winter base, while still sending people and animals to satellite camps. Fixed and portable shelter can exist inside the same seasonal system. The contradiction disappears once you stop treating nomadism as a refusal to own buildings. Mobility is not homelessness. It is the controlled movement of animals, people, and equipment between useful places. The house is one of those places. So is the tent. Outside, a low livestock shelter or enclosure adds another layer. The attraction is obvious. Animals brought behind walls or under cover lose less exposure to wind and blowing snow. Across the Tibetan steppe, investment in houses and animal shelters became especially associated with winter-spring pasture, precisely where cold season risk is greatest. But now the old problem returns in a new coat. An animal standing behind a wall still has to eat. Oral histories from Nagchu identify mobility, stored feed, and covers or shelters as important snowstorm responses. The fact that these strategies appear together matters. Shelter handles exposure, feed handles temporary loss of grazing, mobility handles the possibility that usable pasture exists somewhere else. None replaces the others. You look from the shelter toward the white slope. The animals are safer from wind. The grass is still under snow. This is the midpoint where the simple story finally fails. At first, the black tent seemed to be the secret. Then mobility seemed to be the secret. Now neither is enough. A tent can move only while animals are strong enough to travel. A herd can move only while another pasture remains reachable. A fixed shelter can protect livestock only while feed remains available. Stored fodder buys time only until the stack is gone. The household is not choosing between mobility and permanence. It is balancing them. That balance became especially visible in 20th and early 21st century parlour. By 2009, Goldstein recorded motorcycles, trucks, improved roads and widespread houses, yet households still moved with animals to full pasture, lived there in tents for roughly 4 months, and established additional satellite tent camps for distant herds. The old system absorbs new objects. That is what functioning systems tend to do. You hear an engine somewhere beyond the ridge. A truck or motorcycle can move a person, food, or equipment faster than a pack caravan. In an emergency, transport changes the radius of what is possible. Supplies can travel farther and faster. A worker can cover distance without spending as much human or animal energy. But vehicles introduce their own dependencies. Fuel,
road access,
cash, mechanical parts, a route not blocked by snow. The machine defeats distance until the road disappears. Then it becomes a very expensive object standing still. This is the same logic you have seen all week. Every solution removes one constraint and introduces another. Yak transport is slow but does not need gasoline. A truck is fast but needs a usable route. A tent is light but exposed. A house is strong but cannot follow pasture. Stored feed protects livestock but must be produced, bought, transported and stored beforehand. A livestock shelter reduces weather exposure but cannot graze on behalf of the animals inside it. The strongest system is therefore not the one with the most impressive single technology. It is the one that avoids making every survival function depend on the same point of failure. You return outside. The wind has begun lifting snow off the roof. Near the enclosure, someone carries fodder to a smaller group of animals. Not every animal can be fed indefinitely this way. The reserve is too valuable. Shelter and feed therefore matter most when they are used as part of a larger decision about which animals need protection and how long the household can keep supplying it. Again, infrastructure does not eliminate judgment. It gives judgment more tools. That distinction is easy to miss when looking backward from a modern city. We tend to sort people into neat categories. Nomadic, settled, traditional, modern, tent, house, animal transport, motor vehicle, on the ground. Those categories blur. The Fowler evidence shows this clearly. Houses were considered more comfortable in winter, yet they did not end seasonal pastoral movement. Motorcycles and trucks increasingly replaced horses and tractors for transportation, while livestock raising and the production and trading of animal products continued. The useful question is not whether the system is pure. The useful question is what each object allows the household to do when the weather removes another option. That makes the winter house less like the opposite of the tent. It becomes a reserve of stability. The tent is a reserve of movement. You need both only because the plateau can punish both staying and moving. Stay too long where forage is buried, and animals weaken. Move too far in a storm, and they spend energy they cannot replace. A fixed base helps you wait. A portable camp helps you leave. Snow decides which ability becomes more valuable. By evening, the next storm finally arrives. This time, you are not inside the tent. You are standing in the doorway of the winter house, looking toward a dark, portable shelter farther across the grazing ground. Both are occupied. One keeps people and supplies at a stable base. The other keeps workers closer to animals that still need access to grazing farther away. The scene destroys the old image completely. There is no contest between a primitive tent and a superior building. There is a network of shelters performing different jobs. The same household needs solidity here and portability there. The same winter can reward both. Inside the house, supplies sit against the wall. Outside, animals crowd behind a barrier. Beyond them, another group remains near the mobile camp. The weather has forced the system to spread itself across fixed and moving pieces. That is not a failure of pastoral mobility. It helps explain why mobility could survive alongside things that do not move. The black tent was never powerful because everything else was absent. It was powerful because it could go where the walls could not. And when the storm made movement impossible, the walls finally earned their place. A fence appears where yesterday there was only snow. It is not tall enough to stop the wind. It is not meant to. Wire stretches across the pasture, marking a boundary that animals now have to respect even when the weather does not. For the first time, the problem is not whether the tent can move. It is whether movement is allowed to remain useful. In Nagchu, researchers studying snowstorm coping found that mobility had long been central because herders could move animals toward forage that remained accessible when customary grazing was buried. But they also documented a long-term decline in mobility as administrative boundaries, changing land use rights, fencing, development policies, and broader economic changes altered how pastoralists could use space. In some of the study communities, families no longer moved to pastures they had used before because those areas had been reassigned or fenced off. Now the portable tent has met something it cannot solve. A rope can be untied. A legal boundary cannot. You walk toward the fence with animals behind you. On the other side, the snow looks thinner. That does not make the grass yours. This is the difference between physical mobility and effective mobility. Physical mobility means the herd is capable of walking. Effective mobility means there is somewhere useful it can actually go, a route it can use, and enough labor and permission to get there. Remove any one of those, and portability becomes less valuable. This does not mean fencing always harms pastoral households. The Nagchu study found a genuine trade-off. Fenced reserve pasture could keep grass unused for several months and protect it for lambing, calving, weak animals, or snow emergencies. In one Western study site, where households still made several seasonal movements each year, herders felt reserve fencing improved seasonal management and livestock condition. The fence can therefore preserve an option. Then it can remove another. In other villages studied by the same researchers, excessive fencing made it harder for weakened livestock to travel around barriers during snowstorms. Poorer households that had not contributed money toward reserve fencing could also be excluded from using fenced reserve grass. The authors concluded that the benefits of reserve pasture were uneven and appeared stronger where broader seasonal mobility was still maintained. You stop beside the wire. The contradiction is almost embarrassingly visible. Grass has been saved for an emergency. Access to saved grass can itself become part of the emergency. This is where the story moves beyond equipment. A yak-hair tent tells you what a household can carry. A pasture boundary tells you what a household is entitled to use. That distinction changes who can survive the same storm. Two families may have tents of similar quality. Their animals may be equally strong. They may recognize the same snow pattern. But if one family can reach reserve grazing, hire transport, call on enough workers, or arrange access beyond its usual pasture, while another cannot, the weather is no longer the only difference between them. Institutions are inside the blizzard too. Researchers in Nagchu describe adaptive capacity as shaped not just by exposure and livestock condition, but by institutions and entitlements, the arrangements that determine access to resources and the ability to act. Their case studies found that the usefulness of mobility, communal pooling, storage, and shelter had all changed with political, economic, and institutional transformations. That sounds abstract until a hungry animal reaches a boundary. Then an entitlement becomes wire, or permission, or a truck, or a person with the authority to open another route. During severe snow events, emergency movement may require coordination beyond one household, or even one local administrative unit. The same Nagchu research notes that state interventions could provide relief, shelters, and sometimes coordination for access elsewhere. At the same time, the authors argue that some development and environmental policies reduced older forms of mobility and labor availability, increasing dependence on external assistance. So power enters the tent quietly, not as a speech, as a change in who must ask whom before animals can move. In an older, more internally coordinated system, households might rely heavily on local knowledge, communal arrangements, reciprocal labor, and established pasture practices. In a more administratively divided system, some decisions shift outward. A household may still know exactly what it wants to do. It may need someone else to make that option possible. This is not a simple story of old freedom and new restriction. Roads can increase mobility. Trucks can move animals farther and faster. Telephones can help coordinate assistance. Reserve pasture can protect forage. Emergency aid can replace food, clothing, or livestock after catastrophic loss. The same institutional world can create new options while narrowing others. The Nagchu researchers explicitly found both effects. State intervention strengthened some coping strategies while making other forms of adaptation more difficult. That is why the system cannot be reduced to a judgment about whether change was good or bad. The useful question remains causal. What happens to winter risk when one tool is added and another option disappears? A truck may let yaks escape deep snow 40 kilometers away. One case in Nagchu described a household able to transport yaks by truck to a neighbouring township with much less snow, while another household that wanted to make a similar move could not and lost a larger share of its animals. Knowledge was not the difference. Access to effective movement was. Now the truck becomes more than modern convenience. It becomes an entitlement measured in kilometres. But the household that cannot obtain it still faces the same white slope. You return to the tent after dark. The fence is no longer visible. Its effects remain. Some animals are closer to camp because their grazing route has narrowed. More use of a smaller area can make pasture management harder. A reserve may protect grass for later, but it has to be distributed somehow. Household income may help buy fodder, rent pasture, or gain transport. Cooperation may reopen possibilities that individual holdings close. A 2014 study of pastoral vulnerability in Nagchu found herders responding to changing conditions through buying fodder, planting forage, renting pasture, joining formal or informal cooperatives, and diversifying livelihoods. Its authors argued for policies that support cooperation and restore flexible rangeland mobility, rather than treating mobility as a problem to eliminate. Notice what has happened to the original question. You began by asking how people survived blizzards inside portable tents. The tent is still here, but the decisive space has expanded beyond its ropes. The household needs physical shelter, then forage, then labour, then access, then institutions that allow those resources to be connected when conditions change. Portability is useful only inside a landscape where choices still exist. That is the deeper cost of a boundary. It does not need to make the tent colder. It only needs to remove the warmer options somewhere else. Near midnight, the wind rises again. The black cloth flexes. The animals settle close to the camp. Beyond the darkness lies pasture you cannot see. Some of it is buried. Some of it is exposed. Some may be reserved. Some may belong to another grazing unit. The blizzard treats all of it as one continuous white landscape. People do not, and survival depends partly on the difference. The storm is over, but the loss has only begun. Morning arrives clear enough to count what is missing. One yak does not stand. 3 sheep are gone from the group you checked yesterday. Another animal is alive but too weak to follow the others toward exposed grass. The tent still stands exactly where it stood before the snow. That is the cruel part. A household can survive the blizzard and still lose the future it was supposed to protect. For pastoral families, livestock are not only food stored on 4 legs, they are transport, milk, fibre, breeding capacity, fuel production, trade value, and the means of rebuilding after a bad season. When snow kills animals in large numbers, the damage therefore does not end when the carcasses freeze. It moves forward. A breeding female lost this week removes offspring that would have existed next year. A pack yak lost now makes the next migration harder. A reduced sheep or goat herd means less meat, less fibre, fewer animals available for exchange, and fewer bodies able to reproduce the herd. The snow melts. The missing animals do not return with it. This is where an older disaster from Nagchu helps us see the true scale of winter risk. Archival reports studied by historian Pema Gyal describe an extraordinary snow disaster in 1828 across the greater Nagchu region. Local officials called the event unprecedented within living memory. Reports sent between regional leaders, the Tibetan government in Lhasa, and Qing officials described tens of thousands of livestock deaths, famine, migration, and severe social disruption. In surveyed parts of Namru, more than half of the recorded livestock value was reported lost. That number is difficult to picture from inside one tent. So shrink it, take every second animal around you and remove it. Then remember that the remaining animals still need to carry the household through the next season. The archival language sometimes becomes even harsher. Reports describe some communities as effectively wiped out, although the documents also make clear that migration complicates those figures. People did not simply die where they stood. Some fled toward neighboring regions, and years later, officials were still trying to understand who had left, who remained, and whether displaced households would return. That uncertainty is important. A disaster record is not a perfect camera. It is paperwork produced for reasons: requesting relief, counting losses, settling obligations, assigning authority, or explaining why taxes and services could not be delivered. The numbers tell us something real. They do not tell us everything. What they reveal most clearly is duration. By 1831, years after the 1828 snowfall, correspondence from Nagchu was still describing poverty, migration, and violence connected to the aftermath. Some displaced communities had not returned. Reports also complained of livestock raiding and banditry. The blizzard lasted days. Its social shadow lasted years. You look again at the weak animal beside camp. Now the real meaning of a reserve becomes obvious. A reserve is not just something that keeps you alive until the sky clears. It is something that keeps the household capable of rebuilding afterward. That changes how every difficult decision feels. Suppose you slaughter one weak animal now. You preserve meat. You reduce the number of mouths competing for scarce forage. But you may also remove future reproduction or transport. Suppose you feed scarce fodder to that animal instead. You spend a reserve that stronger animals may need later. Suppose you move the whole herd. You may find grass. You may also push weakened animals beyond what they can manage. There is no decision without a cost pushed somewhere else. The household is not choosing between survival and loss. It is choosing which loss is least damaging. That is a much harder kind of expertise. By midday, people begin separating the animals that can move from those that cannot. This is not yet a catastrophe on the scale of 1828. That comparison would be dishonest. Most storms are not historic disasters. Many produce inconvenience, lost body weight, higher feeding costs, or a limited number of livestock deaths rather than social collapse. The larger event matters because it exposes the same mechanism at its extreme. Pastoral wealth can disappear quickly when too much of the herd dies at once. Modern research in Nagchu describes severe snowstorms as capable of producing rapid impoverishment because livestock are both a major source of subsistence and income. The key word is rapid. A household can take years to build a herd. Snow can reduce it in days. And rebuilding is not simply buying back the number written in yesterday's notebook. You need the right animals, breeding females, animals of useful ages, transport animals, enough surviving stock to produce food while reproduction slowly restores numbers. Time becomes another resource. A lamb or calf cannot be hurried because the household is poor. Biology keeps its own calendar. That is why disaster relief can reach beyond food for people. After the 1828 Nagchu disaster, archival evidence records grain relief, tax suspensions, and funds intended for purchasing replacement livestock. The Tibetan government and Qing authorities responded through overlapping jurisdictions, and the distribution was not uniform across all affected communities. The details belong to a particular political world. The underlying logic is familiar. If the pastoral economy has been damaged through livestock loss, replacing only human calories does not restore the economy. You can feed a family today and still leave it unable to produce next year's milk. Replacement animals are a form of reconstruction. So is temporary freedom from obligations? The archival record notes tax relief because a household stripped of livestock cannot be treated as though its productive capacity remains unchanged. The storm has altered what the household can give. That is when weather enters politics. Someone has to decide whose losses count. Someone has to record them. Someone distributes grain. Someone decides which jurisdiction is responsible. Someone receives aid first. Someone waits. Even a relief caravan needs routes, pack animals, labour, and permission to travel. A disaster creates administration because need has become too large for the tent to contain. Late in the afternoon you walk past the place where one animal died. There is no dramatic lesson in the snow. Only an empty space in the herd. That emptiness will keep changing shape. Tonight it means less dung near camp. Later it may mean less milk. During the next move, it may mean another animal has to carry more. At breeding time it may mean fewer offspring. At market it may mean less to sell. The cost travels forward through ordinary tasks. This is the human price hidden behind the phrase livestock mortality. People do not simply mourn an animal and continue with a slightly smaller number. They reorganize work. They delay plans. They consume resources that were meant for later. They may borrow, sell, migrate, seek aid, combine herds, or reduce household expenses. Each adjustment keeps the system moving. Each also proves that the storm changed it. Near sunset, the animals that manage to graze return slowly. You count them again. The number is lower than before the storm. But it is not zero. That difference now carries enormous weight. The surviving herd is food. It is labour. It is next year's breeding base. It is the possibility that a household damaged this winter can still be pastoral next winter. The tent protected bodies during the wind. The deeper struggle begins after the wind stops. Because surviving a blizzard is one thing. Surviving what the blizzard leaves behind is another. A sack of barley sits beside the tent wall. It is a small object compared with the herd outside, and after 12 days of wind, snow, animals, pasture, ropes, fuel and labour, it would be easy to treat it as background. That would be a mistake. Because the barley did not grow here. In Fala, the Western Tibetan pastoral community studied by Melvin Goldstein and Cynthia Beale, roughly half of annual calories came from grain, especially barley. The households raised yak, sheep and goats, but they did not feed themselves from livestock alone. Traditionally, they made winter trading journeys 20 to 30 days toward farming villages and towns, exchanging livestock products and salt for grain. That fact changes the shape of the tent again. You thought you were looking at a self-contained survival machine. You are actually looking at one end of a trade route. The butter in the bowl may come from the herd. The barley flour beside it comes from people living somewhere the animals are not. The robe, rope, skin, wool, salt, grain and livestock products move through different hands and landscapes before they meet inside this room. So the pastoral household survives by mobility in more than one sense. Animals move toward pasture. Workers move between camps. Goods move between ecological zones. And calories move uphill. The black tent is portable because the household cannot make every necessary thing in one place. That is a deeper form of dependence than the storm first allowed you to see. You scoop grain from the sack. Nothing dramatic happens. That is useful, because ordinary food exposes one of the biggest dangers in telling this story too neatly. Most of the detailed evidence we have been using does not describe every Tibetan pastoral community across all centuries. It describes particular places, periods, households, and researchers' observations. Phala is one Western Tibetan case. Nagchu is another. Museum documentation records particular material traditions. An archival snow report tells us what officials counted, requested, or considered important enough to write down. None of those sources gives permission to turn one local practice into a timeless rule for all Tibetan nomads. That boundary matters. When Goldstein and Beale describe Fala households using a home-based tent site, winter trade, satellite camps, and specific pasture arrangements, they are giving us powerful evidence about Fala. They are not handing us a universal instruction manual titled How Tibetans Survived Snow. Even within Pala, the precise movement pattern could vary among grazing groups because forage and labour differed locally. Satellite camps were established when conditions and available workers allowed them. A household could operate a main camp, a yak camp, and a sheep-goat camp at the same time, while another household lacked enough labour to do so. The variation is part of the answer. You cannot remove it without making the story easier and less true. Outside, the wind pushes a thin veil of snow over the camp. Inside, the grain sack remains still. It also reveals something the camera usually misses. A famous image of Tibetan pastoral life can isolate the tent against empty high country. The frame contains cloth, animals, snow, and perhaps one herder. The trade journey is outside the frame. So are the farmers who grew the barley. So are the agents who handled wool. So are people tanning skins, building walls, carrying salt, or moving goods between the plateau and agricultural settlements. The photograph makes the household look alone because distance photographs well. Dependency does not. Yet the Fala evidence shows exchange was integral to subsistence. Livestock products went outward, grain and other commodities came back. Some villagers travelled onto the Changthang in summer to barter with pastoralists. Pastoralists also made long winter journeys to farming areas. The isolated tent is therefore partly an optical illusion. It can stand far from the next settlement without being economically separate from it. That distinction becomes especially important in winter. A household that loses animals does not only lose direct food, it may lose products that would have been exchanged for grain. Wool can become purchasing power. Butter can become trade. Live animals can become another commodity. The herd supports the household partly through things the family consumes and partly through things it can exchange. A blizzard can damage both channels at once. Now a dead sheep is not merely missing meat. It may also be missing wool, missed trade value, missing future offspring, and, through exchange, missing grain that would have entered the tent later. The cost spreads sideways as well as forward. This is why evidence about diet matters to a story about shelter. If you imagine the tent as a closed survival bubble, you will misunderstand what has to survive. Not just the people inside. The connections outside. Pasture must still produce animals. Animals must still produce usable goods. Routes must remain workable often enough. Other communities must still have something to exchange. Someone must possess the labour to travel. A portable tent can protect a trading household. It cannot replace the trade. There is another caution here. The historical record is usually strongest where somebody measured, counted, taxed, traded, photographed, administered, or studied something. That means certain forms of life become easier for us to see. Livestock numbers leave tables. Pasture allocations leave administrative descriptions. Major snow disasters leave petitions and relief records. Tent construction leaves museum objects and photographs. But 100 small judgments made before bad weather may leave almost nothing. A person notices that one animal is thinner. Someone moves fuel closer to the stove. Someone decides not to graze a patch yet. A worker remembers where snow drifted last winter. A relative agrees to watch another herd. A bag is repaired before the journey. No official may record any of it. Yet those decisions can shape the outcome more than the dramatic object preserved in a collection. This is where we have to resist inventing details simply because silence feels unsatisfying. We can say the sources show labour constraints. We can say they show seasonal movement. We can say they show grain dependence, trade, herd products, pasture rights, winter camps and snow losses. We cannot automatically assign every task to the same gender in every region. We cannot give every household the same winter routine. We cannot pretend a 20th century ethnography proves an unchanged practice in the 18th century. And we cannot turn practical knowledge into magical weather prediction. The gaps are not defects to hide. They tell us where the story must stay careful. You tie the barley sack closed. The knot is ordinary. So is the conclusion it carries. The tent survived because it belonged to a world larger than the tent. Grass from one slope became wool. Wool moved toward a buyer. Grain moved back toward the plateau. Milk became butter. Dung became heat. Labour became mobility. Rights became access. Memory became a decision made before snow fell. Some of those links are documented clearly. Some are visible only in particular places and periods. Some remain uncertain. The evidence does not weaken the story by limiting it. It makes the survival system more impressive for the right reason. Not because every Tibetan pastoralist possessed the same ancient secret, because real households kept combining local knowledge, animals, trade, labour, landscape, and changing institutions without any guarantee that winter would cooperate. The wind presses once against the black cloth. Beside you, the barley sack does not move. It has already travelled farther than the tent will tonight. The morning after the storm is almost quiet. Snow lies hard against the lower wall. A rope has frozen stiff where it meets the ground. Farther out, animals are already searching for the dark strips where wind exposed grass. Nothing in the camp looks like a single answer. That may be the answer. Across the cold grasslands of the Tibetan Plateau, winter survival depended on several protections that overlapped without perfectly replacing one another. Pastoral studies describe the value of seasonal mobility, winter and spring pasture, livestock shelters, stored or reserved forage, strong animal condition going into winter, and access to key grazing sites. Each solved a different failure. The system worked because winter rarely attacked only one thing. Cold attacked bodies, wind attacked shelter, snow attacked forage, distance attacked labour, boundaries attacked movement, livestock loss attacked next year's production. So the household needed more than one way to keep going. You kneel beside the frozen rope and pull. It holds. That rope is one small reserve. If the wind tears at the cloth, tension transfers the load into the ground. If one line loosens, another may keep the panel from collapsing long enough for somebody to repair it. The same pattern appears beyond the tent. If pasture near camp becomes covered, a household may move animals. If movement becomes difficult, reserved grass or fodder may buy time. If animals cannot remain exposed, a wall or shelter may reduce weather stress. If one household lacks enough workers, cooperation may provide labour. If local production fails badly enough, trade or relief may bring resources from somewhere else. None of those layers is unlimited. That is exactly why there are several FAO reviews of the Tibetan steppe make a similar point from the landscape side. Permanent houses, livestock shelters, fenced hay areas, and winter-spring enclosures can fit a mobile pastoral system, as long as animals still retain enough opportunistic movement to reach valuable grazing patches when conditions change. Mobility and fixed infrastructure do not cancel each other. They cover different risks. You walk toward the winter pasture. The snow here is thinner. That does not mean today began with luck alone. Animals reaching this season in good condition carry part of summer with them across cold, semi-arid Asian pastoral systems. A major survival strategy is to build enough weight and fat during the growing season in autumn to endure the long winter and early spring when feed becomes scarce. The reserve is under the skin. You cannot see it stacked beside the tent. But when grazing becomes poor for 3 days, body condition becomes one of the first buffers the herd spends. This changes the meaning of summer grass. It is winter infrastructure before winter exists. Good forage in August can become energy used in February. A pasture left for later can become emergency feed. A breeding animal kept healthy can become next year's herd recovery. Time links everything. The tent carries objects through space. Pastoral management carries resources through seasons. That second kind of portability may matter even more. A gust pushes loose snow across your boots. You watch one yak scrape toward vegetation. For now, the animal can feed itself. That saves stored fodder. Saving fodder keeps another option available. Keeping that option alive may matter if the next snowfall is worse. Small victories preserve later choices. This is why redundancy should not be confused with abundance. A household can possess several buffers and still live close to their limits. There may be a tent and a house, but only one useful winter range. There may be fodder, but not enough for the entire herd. There may be neighbours, but their animals also need care. There may be a vehicle, but the road can close. There may be reserve pasture, but access can be unequal. Every backup has its own point of failure. The system is strong because those failure points are different. If all survival depended on one store of hay, one road, one grazing patch, or one type of shelter, a single disruption could end the story quickly. Instead, people keep converting one remaining advantage into another. Animal strength becomes movement. Movement becomes access to grass. Grass becomes milk, meat, fibre, and dung. Dung becomes heat. Fibre becomes cloth and rope. Trade goods become grain. Relationships become labour. A winter house becomes a place to hold supplies. A tent becomes a way to follow the herd. The chain looks circular because much of it is break enough links at once, though, and the circle opens. This is what extreme snow disasters reveal. A normal winter lets the household move between buffers gradually. A severe one forces several buffers to fail together. Snow covers pasture while animals are already thin. Roads become difficult while fodder is running low. Workers become exhausted while more animals need attention. Neighbouring households face the same shortage, reducing what they can share. At that point, resilience stops sounding like toughness. It becomes remaining options. You return toward camp carrying a small bundle. The word resilience often makes survival sound like a quality stored inside people, as though some households simply possess more determination. The material evidence points somewhere more concrete. Determination cannot feed a yak. Skill matters, judgment matters, experience matters, but they operate through resources. A herder can recognize better pasture and still need permission to use it. A family can know it should move and still lack enough workers. A household can own animals and still enter winter with them in poor condition after a bad grazing season. A community can possess deep local knowledge and still face a snow event outside the range its reserves can absorb. Agency remains real. So do constraints. That balance is important because it restores people to the story without turning them into legends. They were not passive victims of altitude. They were also not immune to it. They planned, moved, stored, exchanged, repaired, watched, rationed, cooperated, and sometimes lost anyway. The achievement lies in how many ordinary decisions had to work often enough. Near the tent, someone shakes snow from a skin. Another person opens the fuel stack. A child carries something small between the shelter and the animals. The scene is almost disappointingly ordinary. That is useful too. The strongest protection against a rare crisis is often built from tasks that do not look like crisis management while they are happening. Gathering fuel before snow, maintaining a rope before wind, preserving pasture before scarcity, fattening animals before winter, maintaining relationships before help is needed, keeping the tent portable before movement becomes urgent. Each task creates a little distance between trouble and catastrophe. By late afternoon, salt reaches the dark fabric. The snow on one side begins to soften. Drops form along a lower seam and fall onto frozen ground. The tent has survived another storm, but by now you know better than to give it all the credit. Its importance is more precise. It is light enough to follow pasture, repairable enough to keep working, strong enough, when well sighted and anchored, to reduce exposure, small enough to organize life around a limited source of heat, and ordinary enough to sit inside a much larger network of animals, people, pastures, stored energy, trade, infrastructure, and rights. That network is why the shelter can remain simple. It does not have to solve winter by itself. As darkness returns, the household begins the same quiet sequence again. Animals are counted. Fuel is brought close. Ropes are checked. Food is prepared. No one knows whether another storm will arrive tomorrow. They do not need every answer tonight. They need enough options left when morning comes. The tent settles under the wind. Tomorrow, there is only one question left. What exactly made this portable home enough? The last night begins without a storm. The sky has cleared enough for stars to appear over the plateau, sharp and cold above the dark line of the hills. Snow still lies around the camp, but the wind has eased. The tent no longer snaps, it breathes. You stand outside for a moment and look at it. After everything the weather has demanded, the shelter seems almost too simple. Woven yak-hair, ropes, poles, anchors, a low dark shape on open ground. Yet that simplicity is not evidence that the people inside lacked better ideas. It reflects a pastoral system built around movement. Across the Tibetan steppe, yak-hair tents belonged to a livestock economy combining seasonal grazing, herds, fuel, trade, and winter shelter. In Pala, researchers found a main home base with protected tent sites and additional satellite camps created when forage and labour made them useful. The portable tent was one tool inside that larger arrangement. That is the answer the storm has been pushing toward all along. Tibetan pastoralists survived high-altitude blizzards in portable tents not because the tents were warm enough to defeat the plateau, but because the household rarely asked the tent to do that. It only had to do its part. You duck through the entrance. The air inside is warmer near the stove and colder near the cloth. A robe stays wrapped around a body. Bedding separates sleepers from the ground. Fuel sits close enough to reach. Heat is kept where it matters. The same principle reaches outward. A windbreak protects the tent without protecting the whole valley. A reserved patch of pasture protects forage without feeding the entire herd forever. A store of dung protects the fire for a time. Body fat protects an animal for a time. A neighbouring worker protects one task by freeing another pair of hands. Trade protects the household from having to produce every calorie from livestock. Movement protects the herd only while there remains somewhere useful to move. Each protection is partial. Together, and you begin to realise how. That is why the word portable matters more than it first seemed. The tent can follow animals toward grass, but portability is not simply lightness. It is the ability to keep household life connected to a food source that changes across seasons. In Pala, seasonal movement preserved grazing at the home base, while fall pasture was used for several months, and satellite camps could be created for particular animals when labour allowed. The shelter follows the economy. The economy follows the grass. The grass follows weather and season. And people spend their lives learning how far each link can be trusted. You sit near the stove. A few pieces of dried dung are added to the fire. Nothing here promises independence. The yak that supplied part of the tent also depended on forage. The forage depended on access to land. Access depended partly on local arrangements and institutions. Grain could arrive through trade rather than from the pasture itself. A truck might extend mobility but depend on a road. A house might improve winter comfort but remain fixed when animals had to graze elsewhere. Every strength rested on something else. That is the deeper truth hidden inside the image of the solitary black tent. The household was not surviving because it had cut itself off from the world. It survived by staying connected to many parts of it at once. Animal to pasture, worker to herd, tent to ground, fuel to animal, grain to trade, household to neighbour, present choices to next season. When one connection weakened, another sometimes bought time. Sometimes it did not. The sources are clear enough to stop us from turning this into a legend. Severe snowstorms could still kill large numbers of animals. Households could still become poorer. Mobility could be constrained by labour, access, deep snow, or weakened stock. Oral histories from Nagchu identify mobility, feed storage, and livestock shelter as important responses, precisely because no single measure removed the danger. There was no secret technique that made the cold harmless. There was practiced vulnerability. People knew they could lose animals. They knew a rope could loosen. They knew pasture could disappear beneath snow. They knew winter reserves were finite. The intelligence of the system lay in acting before every limit arrived at once. That changes the way the tent looks. At the beginning, it seemed like the weakest object in the landscape. Now it looks deliberately incomplete. It does not carry stone walls because stone walls cannot follow sheep. It does not seal every opening because smoke must leave. It does not contain a season's entire food supply because much of that supply is alive outside. It does not promise permanence because permanence can become a liability when forage fails somewhere else. Its limits are partly what make it useful. You reach toward the wall. The coarse fabric is cold. Outside it, the plateau extends far beyond the small circle of warmth around the stove. There are winter pastures, old tracks, walls, grazing boundaries, exposed slopes, buried hollows, and places remembered because animals once found grass there after snow. The tent cannot control any of them. It can only move among them. And that is enough to understand the title now. How did Tibetan nomads survive high-altitude blizzards in portable tents? They survived by making the tent one movable layer in a wider survival system, sheltering bodies instead of whole landscapes, preserving access to pasture, keeping animals productive, carrying heat in clothing and bedding, storing food and fuel where possible, dividing labour, cooperating, trading, and moving when conditions still allowed it. Not every household had the same resources. Not every storm was survivable. Not every region followed the same routine. But where the system worked, the tent's portability was not a weakness waiting to be overcome. It was one way the household kept options open. Night settles over the camp. No new decision is needed now. The animals have been counted. The ropes are holding. The fuel beside the stove will last through the next few hours. You lie down. The world outside is still enormous. White ground runs beyond the tent, beyond the herd, beyond the dark ridge. The cold remains exactly what it was. Nothing about the plateau has softened because you understand it better. But the world begins to shrink. First to the camp, then to the tent, then to the small sleeping space beside the stove. A folded robe rests near your shoulder. Bedding holds you away from the cold ground. Someone nearby shifts once and becomes still. The fire gives a quiet crack. Above you, the black cloth moves gently between its ropes. This is the same tent that looked almost absurd at the beginning. Thin against the wind, portable in a place that seemed to demand walls. Now its shape carries a different meaning. It was never a fortress. It was a pause that could be packed. A warm enough room between one pasture and the next. A place where people could eat, mend, count, decide, sleep, then rise and follow what the animals needed. Outside, a yak moves once in the darkness. Then nothing. The herd is close. The wind has dropped. Your hands are warm inside the robe. The stove dims from orange to red. There is no need to hold the whole plateau in your mind anymore. Only the tent. Then only the bedding. Then the weight of your body resting against it. Your breathing slows. The ropes remain tight beyond the cloth. The snow lies still beyond the ropes. And for tonight, no one has to move. The portable home has done enough. So have you... The fire settles. The tent breathes once more in the dark, and the plateau becomes quiet.